Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a new edition of the Daily Debate. In tonight's show, we're going to be tackling the African file, Egypt's relation with the African affairs, also Egypt presiding over the African Union. We're going to be tackling the situation, the development and the situation of Sudan and the Egyptian exports to the rest of the African continent. And joining us here in the studio to shed more light on this issue is Mr. Hassan Shaban, the former assistant to the chairman of the Wafd party, also the expert on African affairs. Mr. Shaban, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for inviting me. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, before we start our discussion, let's check out this report regarding the visit by our Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry to Sudan, meeting the main representatives of the cabinet there, and we'll be right back.
The Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry paid a visit to the Sudanese capital, Khartoum, to begin what Cairo hailed as a new start in relations as Sudan embarks on a transition to civilian rule. During his stay, Shoukry held talks with Sudanese officials, including the new Prime Minister, Abdullah, and Sudan's first female Foreign Affairs Minister, Asma Mohammed Abdullah. Also, a meeting with General Abdel al-Burhan, the head of a joint civilian-military sovereign council that is overseeing Sudan's transition, took place to probe the ongoing developments in the country and the formation of the government. The meetings between the top diplomat and Sudanese officials centered on means to push forward bilateral relations in various domains, especially on the political and economic fronts. Ahead of the visit, the Foreign Ministry issued a statement saying that Shoukry's visit to Sudan is considered of great importance because it establishes a new start in Sudanese and Egyptian relations. According to the statement, the visit also shows Egypt's support for Sudan and to its people in achieving their wishes. It said the visit is of special importance since it comes at the start of the new phase of cooperation between the two countries to face challenges and coordinate stances on regional and international issues. Al-Burhan's choice of Egypt as the first country to visit since he took over as the head of Sudan's Transitional Military Council showed a strong desire to open a new chapter in relations with Cairo. In fact, it has a lot to offer Sudan to help it get over the problems of the transition. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi told Burhan that he followed the developments in Sudan closely and that Egypt was ready to offer whatever support needed to help the country overcome the difficulties it faces. The president asserted that Egypt backs the free will of the Sudanese people and its desire to formulate Sudan's future. Within the framework of Egypt's presidency of the African Union, President el-Sisi has received a number of African leaders, including his Eritrean counterpart, Isaias Afwerki, Libyan commander Khalifa Haftar, and Algeria's president Abdul Qadir bin Salah, among others.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and we're also joined here in the studio by Mr. Abdullah Kagma, the researcher specialized in African affairs. Mr. Kagma, thank you very much for joining us. Mr. Shaban, first of all, now the Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry went to Sudan, trying to re-establish the relations with the new city, the new country, the new cabinet. Do you think that the relationship with Sudan now under the new cabinet after its transition would differ much from the previous relationship between between Egypt and Sudan under Omar al-Bashir?
Definitely, it will be different, especially with our president. President Fattah al-Sisi is the head of the African Union. This means something. This is number one. But again, we're going to always have to remember, always, that we as Egyptians deal with the Sudanese people. Governments is not that relevant in our relationship with the Sudanese people. I've visited Sudan several times, and I know that the Sudanese people look upon Egypt as the big brother. And they expect from the big brother a lot. And the visit that we paid, or our foreign minister paid to Sudan, is a little bit late. It should have been a little bit earlier, but it's better late than never. We need to be there to assist our brothers in Sudan to overcome the problems they're facing economically, politically, all the threats that might threat the revolution, the successful revolution that the Sudanese people achieved. We're going to have to assist them. Also, Egypt is playing an active role in the south of Sudan, actually, in trying to resolve the problems with the fighting troops over there and terrorist activities that might threat Sudan from the south. And they fled to south of Sudan. President Salva Kiir is providing the umbrella to resolve all the problems that Sudan might have with our assistance as Egyptians.
Yes. Well, Mr. Kagma, now, how does the revolution that took place in Sudan compare to the other revolutions that took place across the African continent, mainly the Arab Springs, the ones that started with Tunisia and Egypt in 2011, all these revolutions? How is the Sudanese revolution compared to the previous revolutions? Are they similar? Is it different? Is the process of the transition and development, is it taking a faster pace than the previous revolutions?
Yeah, I think Sudan is a country that is, I would say, somehow silent, and citizens of Sudan, they are that somehow have, there has between them, the interaction between the citizens, I think, is good relations between the citizens. And this transition, what is happening in Sudan and like you said before, in African and some Arab countries, I think all these issues is a time of change. If we know every time or each time or transition of governments, time will come that people need change, and I think Sudan citizens, they realize that they need that change, and they came out to have this change. But I will talk more on the role of African Union, or the role of Egyptian president as the head of African Union in resolving all these situations. I think before the Egyptian president asked to give Sudanese, what do you call it, sometimes for them to resolve the problem by themselves. And I think Africa is there. If we see what happens in Sudan, African Union, I think before, in what happens before in other countries, I don't think that African Union do much about that issue. But now I think in Sudan, if we see all what African leaders, and with the leadership of President Fattah al-Sisi, you will know that, yes, African Union is working well, and our presidents in Africa, they have that, what do you call it, the change start in somehow good way. If we see what happened in Sudan, yes, most people died, etc. All this, what do you call it, something wrong happens. But for African Union to resolve it, at all this short time to get way out all of this conflict or what is going on. I think African Union did much better, and Sudan citizens, they are that wise to understand or to know that their country is in danger, and they try to understand each other for them to resolve this issue by the leadership of African Union. And I think before that, even since February, when President Abdul Fattah Sisi became the chairman of African Union, I think many issues was done in the peace, security issues, all this. And this year is a year that was a refugee year. I think all these issues that tackles Africa, I think we have many issues on the decks which people, or I will say the free trade issue, all these issues, I think that Mr. President Abdul Fattah Sisi tried to show up in this, what do you call it, points, and they tried, the African Union leaders, they try to get way out. Yes. I think, yeah, this is very good for doing that. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, Mr. Shaban, now you've described Egypt's role and its relation in general with Sudan as the brotherly, as a big brother to Sudan and the Sudanese people. Now also Egypt is presiding over the African Union. Do you feel that now it has much more, not just more of an obligation, but also a responsibility or a power to effectively implement serious change within Sudan? We've already seen a lot of meetings taking place here in Egypt between the different Sudanese factions to try and broker a good deal for the Sudanese people that resulted in this cabinet, obviously. But do you see the role of Egypt as a big brother, as a president of the African Union, even extending beyond the establishment of this cabinet, beyond getting over this first step of the transition period?
Definitely. I think we have a very successful experience in Egypt since we actually went through the same process, almost the same process in Egypt. I think President Sisi could help Sudan overcome the economical problem they're facing right now, which is crucial. I think with the help of President Sisi and his excellent relations with the Gulf Council and countries, I think Sudan could receive a lot of help from the Arab countries in the Gulf, and they actually need that. I think with the Gulf countries financing mega projects, agricultural projects in Sudan, Sudan could again resume its dream of becoming the basket of the food for the Middle East. With the triangle, I personally dream of that. We provide agricultural settlements in Sudan, provide them with manpower. Our young people in Egypt should enjoy the privilege of going to Sudan. You see, we have an agreement with Sudan. The 6 freedoms, freedom of transportation, investment. Both sides can enjoy these privileges. We can actually utilize this. And in the past, actually, we were offered vast, actually large areas to establish settlements and grow crops in Sudan. I think we better actually again look into this file again. Economical relations is the strongest relations, and politics that does not have an economical return is a fiasco. Yes. I mean, successful politics is a politics with fruitful results. I think Egypt could help Sudan. We have the expertise, and I think also we have a very good influence in Darfur. things could be quieter in Darfur since President Bashir left. I think things will improve in Darfur. You see, as Egyptians, we do not forget our old flag that had the 3 stars, Egypt, Sudan, and Kordofan. You know, we cannot ignore the fact that we were one country at one time, and we're still very attached to them.
Yes, definitely. Mr. Kagma, now, how do you assess and evaluate this new cabinet? We've seen the foreign minister Sameh Shukri going to meet head of the Sovereign Council Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, also the Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok, also his counterpart, the Foreign Minister Asma Abdullah, a woman, and it was quite a big achievement, a big step really seen by the international community in the new Sudanese cabinet. How do you see this new cabinet, the formation of these ministers with the presence of women ministers quite at an integral ministries there?
Yeah, I think if we see the cabinet, we'll know that women are included in the cabinet, and what do you call it? We think that this cabinet and youth, even youth, was included in the, and I think the foreign minister was a woman.
Yes.
Yeah, I think
yes,
then this is a very sensitive office to be given to a woman. That means that Sudan has changed, and the new Sudan, the Sudanese, they start what they call it, breathing the new Sudan nation, for them to be what do you call it, women included, youth included. And I think the Egyptian, like Mr. President Abdel Fattah and Sameh Shukri, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Egypt tried to be in the issue. I think they helped not only Sudan. Egypt tried to be in Africa since many years back. If we saw the African Organization of African Unity, since the founders of that, the fathers of the unity is President Jamal Abdel Nasser. He's an Egyptian president, and people are saying that Egypt left Africa for some time, but I will say no. If we see, since that time, Egypt has a big role in Africa. If we see the health, in health programs, if we see the ministries in military, what do you call it, way of assisting. And all this issue makes Egypt to be in the side of Africa. And always I'm calling, or I'm telling people, my colleagues, youths, that Egypt is the what do you call in between of Africa and Arab countries. If we saw here in Egypt, President Abdel Fattah Sisi, he is the leader of African Union. At the same time, I think Egypt is one of the main countries that are active in Arab League. All this issue makes Egypt to have a role in bringing up Africa and Arab countries, and this is a good advantage of Egypt. And I think in this year of African leadership of President Abdel Fattah Sisi, I think the Arab and Africans has I will say the golden time, that this is a main time that we need to come together, because if we see the Arab countries and African countries, all the issues between us and the problems, all what is happening is what do you call it, is somehow the same in the both. If we see the refugees, if we see the health aspect, all these aspects are somehow the same in Africa and Arab countries. And I think this Sudan issue is taking away a good, what do you call it, way, and Egyptian role in Sudan is a big role that I think every people know. If we see the Sudanese that are living in Egypt, if we see the Egyptian that are there in Sudan, if we see, I think we have many ways of going to Sudan, by road, by what do you call all these means of transportation. And if we see the business or the people that are benefiting from this, what do you call it, good relation between Sudan and Egypt. I think Egypt plays and is playing role again in Sudan issue and in African an issue, and I want our African countries to benefit from Egyptian experience for this many years, and I'm calling Egyptians to travel to Africa. I think President Abdel Fattah is trying his best to bring up the relationship with African leaders, but I'm calling our youth and citizens. I want my Nigerian citizens to come to Egypt, Egyptian youth to go to Nigeria, for us to have this free movement in Africa and to succeed in the sustainable development of African Union Agenda 2063.
Yes, definitely. Mr. Shaban, now you've mentioned that a good, healthy political relationship would bear good, healthy economic fruit. And you've earlier mentioned that Egypt's role is also safeguarding the Sudanese situation regarding any possible threat coming to Sudan, be it politically or economically. Now, what kind of threats are you referring to, and do you feel that these threats would come from within Sudan, or do you feel that maybe international foreign players would have a role in maybe threatening the Sudanese situation?
Of course, the regime that actually fell in Sudan had its own ties with the Islamic groups, especially the Muslim Brotherhood. Since Turabi was connected to Bashir, of course Turabi passed away and Bashir continued the same system. Unfortunately, Sudan is subject to the same threats that we are facing in Egypt. The south of Libya, which is next door, and Chad, there is a lot of radical and terrorist groups actually are there. The number is huge actually, thousands. Somebody estimated the number of terrorist groups in the south of Sabha, north of Chad, around 30,000. So this is a big number. And of course, the stability of Sudan does not please some of these groups actually. And I think they will try to do something. And Egypt actually should have very close eye to protect Sudan, because if any of these troops infiltrate to Sudan through the borders with Chad and all this, because this area is not that safe actually. We need to be more present. At one time we called for Egypt to establish a military city in Uwainat, close to Darb al-Arba'in, which is a very strategic pass for trading with Sudan to control smuggling armament and narcotics and terrorist activities in this particular area. I think cooperation between Sudan and Egypt in this particular area is very important. The exchange of information, monitoring the terrorist groups' activities. I think it's our responsibility to protect the young revolution in Sudan from any threats coming across the border from these radical groups actually. At one time, Egypt suffered from smuggling armament from the south, our borders with the Sudan. So I think all of this will have to stop in order to protect the young revolution in Sudan, as well as the stability of Egypt. It's mutual security actually. Our security is the security of Sudan, whether we like it or not. We are in the same trench since God created the River Nile actually.
Yes, definitely. Well, Mr. Kagma, now, as Mr. Shaban mentioned, there is a security responsibility and an obligation for Egypt to try and secure these borders from any sort of extremists roaming around these soft borders, if we may say. Now, what about the relationship between Sudan, what's happening there, that young revolution, and also South Sudan? Do you feel that there's some sort of harmony, cooperation and understanding between what's happening in Sudan and South Sudan, and where does Egypt play within this relationship between both countries?
Yeah, I think South Sudan was Sudan before, and when this problem started in Sudan, I'm very happy to see that the Sudanese military visited South Sudan, because I think if some people will say that they were divided from us, the relation will be that blocked. But I'm very happy, even with this situation, Sudan knows, or the Sudanese military knew that that South Sudan is one of the is one time Sudan, and for now is a brother, like Mr. Shaban said. Egyptian, they are brothers to Sudanese. Sudanese military, they are wise in these aspects, that they know that South Sudan is a good place to visit and to talk on security issues, because all problems that is happening, we have in Nigeria, in our local language. They said, if you saw your brother's head was what do you call it, is fire on your brother's head, you try to run or to touch your own head to know that nothing is happening to you. Then I think the Sudanese security is the same thing, security of South Sudan and even Egypt. I think now Mr. Shaban is talking about the Libyan, Chadian, all these issues that Egypt is supposed to help Sudan in tackling all these areas or borders to stop this, what do you call it, the bad peoples in coming in, or in disturbing this unity or this good relation. And I'm very happy too to South Sudan. I think when he visited them, South Sudan, the military, they talk about in his speech when he's talking, he said that Sudan stability is our own stability, and Sudan security means South Sudan security. Then I think this peace, brotherhood or brothership between South Sudan, and the same thing here in Egypt. I think this makes things to be to stop many problems happening. I think Egyptian governments try to help the South Sudan's. If you see what happens since South Sudan was became a country, I think Egyptian did not leave them. If you see now in left them behind. If you see in all countries in Africa, or I will say in the world, the main country that always be beside South Sudan is Egypt. I think Egypt did not left South Sudan or any. Then I think Egypt is playing a big role in what is happening, and Sudanese are wise to understand and to have good relation with Egypt for them to tackle this problem. And I think the coming days will be better with Egyptian leadership and what do you call it, and assistance. Everything will be okay.
Hopefully so. Well, Mr. Shaban, one final question on this topic. Now, this will be mainly Egypt's responsibility to secure these borders and secure the situation in Sudan, but also maybe the Arab League can play a part in it, maybe the African Union can play a part in it, and not just the Egyptian military forces and security forces playing a part in it. Is that a possibility, to get the help of other African Union nations of the Arab League?
It looks like the African Union actually is very active, and it's filling all the spaces right now, the political spaces in Sudan. The African Union as well as Ethiopia actually. They assisted the young revolution, and you know, with our help from the north and help from our friends in Ethiopia to this young revolution, I think Sudan will again be a link between Ethiopia and Egypt. Finally, we need peace in the basin of River Nile. You know, we've never really enjoyed this uptight relations. We need to have peace in our countries, in the three countries. I think Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt are very capable of doing that. The Arab Leagues, definitely, if we have the resources and we have the capabilities to offer any help to the Sudanese people. A lot of people do not really understand that the Sudanese are very cultured and very educated and very aware of, you know, they're almost professional politicians. It's amazing. They're really natural politicians. And they just need some space to breathe. They need to feel free. And I think they had a wonderful revolution, actually. A very short period, didn't take long to achieve what they wanted. Indeed, there was some casualties, but actually no revolutions achieved what they want with no blood. There was some bloodshed. We will always remember the martyrs that actually fell in this revolution, but again, they achieved their goals, and I hope that the military council over there will actually cooperate with the civil community, and we will see a prosperous Sudan again.
Yes, hopefully so. Well, ladies and gentlemen, definitely all the good wishes and all the hard work for a good, healthier, more prosperous Sudan. And in light of Egypt's efforts to reach out with all the African states presiding over the African Union as well, Egypt is trying to increase its exports to African states. Let's check out this report and we'll be right back.
As Egypt gets ready to host the Africa 2019 conference scheduled for November 22nd and 23rd, a report published by the Egyptian Ministry of Trade and Industry expects the volume of Egyptian exports to African countries to increase moving forward. This comes as figures published July the 6th by the Central Agency for Public Mobilization and Statistics, CAPMAS, indicated that the government's increased interest in exporting to neighboring African countries. In 2018, trade exchange between Egypt and African countries increased by 23% to $6.9 billion compared to $5.6 billion in 2017. Egyptian exports to African countries increased by 26.9% to reach $4.7 billion in 2018 compared to $3.7 billion in 2017. CAPMAS also pointed out that Egyptian imports from African countries increased by 15.2% to $2.1 billion in 2018 compared to $1.9 billion in 2017. The increase is the result of the Egyptian Export Development Strategy, and the ministry started implementing it in 2016. In order to encourage exports, the ministry launched a program aimed at providing cash assistance to be deducted from exporting companies' obligations to the Ministry of Finance. In addition, it organizes regular trade missions to African countries. The Egyptian commercial service offices of the Ministry of Trade and Industry are spread across 11 African countries, and they provide exporters with marketing studies about the most promising sectors in Africa and products to be exported to African markets. Such exports will increase further in the next 2 to 3 years, as the government is seeking to increase its exports to Africa by up to 50% in 2019. Egyptian chemical products, fertilizers, food products, iron and steel, electrical appliances, medicine, cement, furniture and textiles were products most in demand in Africa in 2018. The share of African countries from the Egyptian chemical and fertilizer industries amounts to $4 billion out of a total of $5.4 billion. Egypt aims to increase the proportion of its chemical and fertilizer exports to African countries to 20% by 2020.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Kagma, now, as we saw and heard in this report now, the level of exports from Egypt to the African states and the level of imports from the African states to Egypt has dramatically really increased. Now, do you view the sort of a nature of trade between Egypt and the African states, or African states amongst themselves, is it easier than reaching out and trading with the international community, be it the European community, the West and the East?
Yeah, I think I was one time in the World Youth Forum. I was opportune to talk there, and the Mr. President is there. When I thank Egypt on what they did to all what do you call it, world youth, and Mr. President was happy with African youth to talk in this occasion, and he just added some speech. He answered me that if Africa have that free trade issue at that time, he said that all African countries will be safe and they will be developed. When he said that, he says that I'm just feeling, just what do you call it, that then our leaders, African leaders, knows all these issues. What stopped them from what do you call it, from doing it? I think some youths, they are saying that our African leaders are not active, but I see African leaders, all these issues that is going, and they are trying their best to see that Africa is good. And after that, I think it's 2017, the first what do you call World Youth Forum. After that, 18, and I attended even the business in Africa, what do you call it, in Sharm el-Sheikh, the conference, which many African countries leaders attended. And Mr. President, since I say that since 2014, Mr. President Abdullah Sisi is talking about what do you call it, the free business issues in Africa. He's talking about Africa. He wants African and Arab countries to have good relation in business issue, good relation in investment, good relation in all these issues. Because if we see, for example, China in our hometowns in Nigeria, all this, Nigeria is the giant of Africa. Yes. But if we see the investment of Chinese in Nigeria, I think, and Egypt has many things that Nigerians need. And Nigeria has all these many issues that Egypt can benefit from, but we are in the same nation, what do you call it, continents, but you will see that European nations, what do you call it, China, etc., they came, for example, in Nigeria, we have crude oil. And that crude oil, Nigeria is about the 7th country in the world in producing, what do you call it, crude oil. But it will be taken out and it will be processed and sell it back to Nigeria. And I think Egyptian has this experience, a process and experience of, then why not Egyptian go to Nigeria and do this issue? And I think with what we saw now, and the good leadership of Mr. President Abdul Fattah Sisi to African Union, and at the same time, I have some African leaders, for example, Mr. Kagame, Paul Kagame. If we see Mr. President Buhari of Nigeria, we have many active leaders, and they have good relation with Mr. President Abdul Fattah Sisi, and they are that wise for them to not only lead Africa, their countries. They have the what do you call it, image to lead all Africa. And I'm seeing in this G7 summit, it was held last month, I think Mr. President Abdul Fattah Sisi with some African countries leaders, they attended, and Mr. President Abdul Fattah Sisi talks about the peace and security issue and all this, the relationship of this between European and African Union, etc. And I think all these are good things. We start moving. And before, I think youth are saying they are not involved in the government, but Mr. Abdul Fattah Sisi too, he involved youth. Now I think last 2 years is women year. I think last year, what do you call it, youth, we have the leadership program, what do you call it, in the presidential leadership, youth, young youth. I think this issue makes youth to know what is going on. I think now African youth, or especially Egyptian youth, knows the role of government, knows what governments are doing. And I think all African countries will take this way of President Abdul Fattah Sisi of bringing up Africa, what do you call it, youth, and giving them, or explaining to them what our countries are moving on or what is going on. Because tomorrow, if these youth, those youths became something, they will learn from what happens, or what do you call it, the experience of our fathers, and I think Africa will be safe with this.
Definitely. Well, Mr. Shaban, now we've seen the Egyptian efforts and the African Union efforts to encourage the trade and the relationship between African states. Most recently, the Continental Free Trade Agreement also was signed. Now, Egypt is getting ready to host the Africa 2019 summit from November 22nd and 23rd. And many times on the show, you've reiterated the importance of the relationship between African states, and it could be the African continent could be self-sufficient, and they would be developed countries, all of them. Now, we've seen all these meetings taking place, the G7, the TCAD, we've seen the Chinese Arab Economic Conference, also the German African ones. Now, how can we guarantee or have a balanced sort of formula of protecting and trading within, amongst ourselves, the African states, and at the same time have a healthy trade economic relationship with the West, the European Union, the TCAD, the China? How can we find this balance?
First, security is very important. This is number one. And President Sisi, some time ago, like 2 years ago, proposed that we have a united force, military force, that takes care of security up to the equator, North Africa, up, and the cooperation from the South, Nigeria, and South Africa and other countries could take care of the southern portion of Africa. Security means a lot to investments. I mean, without really security, investors will actually not consider Africa as a safe place for investment. This is number one. So we have to revive the idea that President Sisi had some time ago, some other countries opposed to it. I think the U.S. is considering this idea right now. They're thinking about it, and I think we will have something similar to NATO in our countries, our African version of NATO. This is very important. This is number one. Number two, the infrastructure. A project like Alexandria Cape Town Highway. This would connect Alexandria to Khartoum, to Juba, to Addis Ababa, and all the way to Cape Town. Also, some of our brothers in Africa do not have shores, actually. They're trapped, like Chad, like Niger, like Mali. They do not have access to the Mediterranean or to the Atlantic Ocean or the Red Sea. Our shores, so whether it's Egyptian or Sudanese, laterally we need to connect our ports to these countries and render a service to them. Our ports will be their ports on the Red Sea. I mean, like any of the Qusair, for instance, or Safaga could be the port of Chad on the Red Sea, and so forth.
Yes.
I actually think that we require a lot of infrastructure in Africa. It was ignored for some time. This is why actually it was difficult to have internal trade between the countries, because there was no proper means of transportation. At one time, Egyptian salt was required. We used to produce, and we still produce, a lot of salt. And some of the countries, African countries that are trapped and do not have shores, require this salt, because we produce this salt from the Mediterranean, the Red Sea. We used to export salt to Mombasa. And from Mombasa, it goes all the way to the trapped countries. So there was no direct access, Kenya, all the way to from East Africa to the trapped countries in Africa. So actually, if we have access, transportation will be a lot easier. Even our railway, we were one of the leading countries in establishing railway in our country. But when the Brits actually constructed the railway in Sudan, it was different specifications, so our railway couldn't really connect. So that was really very devious at that time. But again, we require to rectify all these mistakes, and we need to work hard to really interconnect.
Most definitely. Well, ladies and gentlemen, definitely there's a lot of work still needing to be done to strengthen the trade relations amongst African states and also reaching out to the international community. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this edition of the Daily Debate. But before we go, I'd like to thank our very distinguished guest, Mr. Hassan Shaban, former assistant to the chairman of Al-Wafd Party and an expert on African affairs. I'd also like to thank Mr. Abdullah Kagma, the researcher specialized in African affairs. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please stay tuned for more coming up on Nile International. I'm Hani Saif. Thank you for joining us.